Hi, Mark. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Well, I mean, you've got a long CV, and I was actually very interested reading about your early life. Now, if somebody asked me what my impressions about you were, I think top of the list in terms of adjectives would be dead clever. But you were no academic at school, were you?
No, I went to a succession of pretty mediocre comprehensives. In fact, the first one I went to, which was called Crichton in Muswell Hill, became the subject of a Sunday Times expose, which was then it was caused such a national scandal. It was turned into a book called the Crichton Report, it was to give you an example. It was probably the most progressive comprehensive in the country. So they had this 7-day timetable. So Monday was day one, then the following Monday was day 6, Tuesday day 7. It then went back to day 1 on the Wednesday, with the upshot that no one knew whether they were coming or going, where they were supposed to be, including the staff. It was supposed to be, liberating and get us out of falling into habits and habituated thinking, but it was just absolute chaos. So I went there, and then I went to a comp in Devon called Kevix, I failed all my O-levels, which was what GCSEs were called back in those days, apart from I got a C in English literature. And I initially decided that I wasn't academically bright. I remember calling my mum when I got my O-level results and saying, "Mum, I think I'm not academically bright," which is a middle-class euphemism for thick as a plank. And I then went on a work experience program and tried my hand at various different manual trades. I worked in a garage, I worked in a kitchen, I actually cleaned toilets for a bit. And I decided after doing that for a few months that actually going back to school and retaking my O-levels was probably the least worst option. So I then retook 3, went off to Israel for 3 months, came back after having taken a year out, then embarked on 3 A-levels.
And the rest is history. How did your years at school shape your attitude to education? Because you are passionate about schooling, and you were the proposer and co-founder of the West London Free School. So what was your sort of experience at school? How did it shape your attitude to how schools should function?
Well, I suppose I went to 2 quite poor, quite progressive comprehensives, one in Muswell Hill and another one in Totnes in Devon, and didn't learn a great deal, didn't feel inspired, didn't work very hard. Nothing really engaged me. I then, when I went to do my A-levels, I was in the last grammar school year of what was a grammar school and is now a comprehensive called William Ellis in North London, and that was a very different experience. A much more traditional school, old-fashioned teachers, imparting traditional subject knowledge, and much clearer boundaries, houses, competitive sport, much like you'd expect an old-fashioned grammar school to be. And that was, for me, transformative. That made all the difference to me. I finally started working, applying myself, did well enough in my A-levels to go on to get into university. And when I came to thinking about what kind of school I wanted my own children to go to, where I now live in Acton. I've got 4 kids, so it was quite an urgent question. We got them into a C of E primary, and that was fine. But my wife and I were worried about what kind of secondary school they'd go to. And I initially, we scouted around trying to find a really good old-fashioned comprehensive that we would be happy with, and the nearest one we could find was in Framlingham, in Suffolk. There were some good schools in Acton, don't get me wrong, but they're mostly C of E schools, Catholic schools, or so oversubscribed you literally have to live virtually within the school gates in order to get your kid in. So we then started making plans to move to Framlingham, and then I had a kind of moment, an epiphany, in which I thought it's just wrong that we should have to move halfway across the country, uproot ourselves, give up our lives in London, just to secure our children a decent education. We pay our taxes. Why can't a decent education be available to all parents in their local area? And that made me, that set me down the path of trying to set up a free school. Took us 2 years, but we got it open in 2011. And I describe it as a comprehensive grammar school. So it has the virtues, I think, of an old-fashioned grammar, but it's open to all, regardless of ability. There's no selection. And it's proved to be a very successful formula, and one that's been replicated by many other schools in other parts of the country. In 2019, the last year, I think, where GCSE results can be taken seriously. We got over, I think, something like 50% of our pupils got 7, 8, or 9 in their GCSEs, which in old money is A or A star, which puts us in the top 1% of comprehensives in the country. And there's nothing particularly posh about our intake. It's in a pretty rough part of London, in one of the most deprived wards in Hammersmith. We get a very mixed group of students coming in, but we get some of the best results in the country because of our old-fashioned, knowledge-rich, disciplined approach. And I think that's the approach that would work best for all children.
So what are the founding values of the school? So it's discipline, school uniform, punctuality, listening to the teacher. What else goes on that makes it so successful?
Well, I guess one of the things which really makes the West London Free School stand out is that the teachers are in their classrooms figures of authority. We have the children are expected not to talk unless they're asked a question in lessons. If they are disruptive, they're sent out. We take respect for the staff very, very seriously. And the teachers, I think, do command the respect and the attention of the children, partly because they are experts in their particular subjects. They love their particular subjects and they love imparting that passion to their students. I think that's really the key. It's putting the teacher at the center of school life. We don't believe in, child-centered education, in trying to teach stuff to kids that they're going to find relevant. We don't believe in project-based learning where you send them to the library and expect them to get interested in something and pursue their own course. We believe in teaching traditional subjects in an old-fashioned way, and that seems to work the best.
Weekly testing, homework.
Yeah, but it's not all grad grindian. We have lots of extracurricular clubs, both at lunchtime and after school. We have proper competitive sport. We have a house system. We have a fantastic music department, a fantastic art department. We put on some fabulous school productions and art shows every year. So it's not just dry academic subjects, but I think we've got the formula right. And I think those schools that have tried to do the same tend to do very, very well. If you look at the schools that top the league table in 2019 in terms of the progress children make at school between the ages of 11 and 16, the measure known as Progress 8, 7 of the top 15 schools in England, this is secondary schools, were free schools. And those 7 are all very similar approach, similar old-fashioned subject-based approach to the West London Free School. That's what works.
I'm pleased to say that Creighton School is no longer, and it's been replaced by Fortismere, which is one of the best comprehensives in the country. So things are clearly on the up. But to what extent do you think political ideology has damaged education in this country?
I think it's been hugely harmful. I think for many years, I think when comprehensives were first rolled out in a big way and grammar schools were phased out, Harold Wilson, the then Labour Prime Minister, described comprehensives as grammar schools for all. That was the phrase he used. I've got into trouble for using that phrase with local Labour councillors, with Labour MPs, with shadow education secretaries. How can you have a grammar school for all? I remember Roy Hattersley spitting at me that it was a contradiction in terms, like a vegetarian butcher. Got really hot under the collar. Just mentioning the word grammar school completely triggered him. And I had to point out that was Harold Wilson's coinage, not mine. That was the original idea, but somewhere along the line, that idea got derailed. And they were thought to be somehow sort of engine rooms of equality for creating a much more equal society. And somewhere along the lines, the original vision got completely lost. I think we are now beginning to recover it. I think in the past 11 years, love or hate the Conservatives, I think education policy has been one of their big successes. Free schools were successful. They stopped grade inflation. They've restored, I think, some of the credibility to GCSEs and A-levels. And if you look at England's position in the international league tables, we were falling for a long time. We're now beginning to climb back up, particularly when it comes to English and maths. So I think it is one of the big success stories, and I think we have begun to restore that original vision for comprehensive schools as grammar schools for all, schools combining old-fashioned standards, houses, uniforms, expecting kids to arrive on time, placing the teacher at the center of school life, but with a much more inclusive approach, whereby you don't just select people on the basis of their religion or their ability or their income level. Anyone can go, but everyone can benefit from what is hopefully a fantastic education.
Clearly, you would encourage more free schools based upon traditional values of education, discipline in the classroom. Do you think we should have more grammar schools as well? It was something that Theresa May toyed with when she was Prime Minister.
Well, I'm not a huge believer that grammar schools were great engines of social mobility, which is the kind of mythology that's grown up around them. Clearly, some people did benefit from going to grammar schools, including me, but there didn't seem to be, there wasn't much evidence when you look at it in any sort of granular detail that they were great stimulants of social mobility. And there's no reason to think a good comprehensive with good old-fashioned standards can't have exactly the same transformative effect on people's life chances that an old-fashioned grammar school can have. I'm not opposed to creating new grammar schools, and I supported that policy. I think if parents want their children to be educated amongst other children who are very academically able, then that shouldn't be something that's only available to the rich who can afford to educate their children privately. But I don't think that it's necessary. I don't think that when parents think that their children will only thrive in a school if they're surrounded by other academically bright children, I think they're mistaken about that, and they can thrive in a mixed ability school, which is fully inclusive just as much.
Toby Young, the pandemic is around 18 or 19 months old. At what point in the pandemic did you realise you were a lockdown skeptic?
Pretty early on, Mark. I wrote a piece for The Critic, where I'm also an associate editor, back in late March of 2020. So I think it was published about not more than a week after the first lockdown was imposed. And my visceral reaction to the lockdown was, has the government really satisfied itself that suspending civil liberties, effectively imprisoning people in their homes for an indefinite period of time, are they really sure that that's going to suppress this virus? Have they done a proper cost-benefit analysis? Are they sure that this particular approach is going to do more good than harm? Because if they're not, then the presumption has to be in favor of preserving our liberties. I'm a great believer in liberty, and I think that if the state wants to claw back any of our God-given freedoms, it needs a very, very good reason to do that. Now, it claimed to have that reason. We were in the midst of a global pandemic. It was a national emergency. But I think at the time I thought, well, I'm not satisfied that this is actually going to make a big enough impact to justify the curtailments of our liberty. And I think, I've subsequently been proved right. And most of the research that's been done now into the impact of lockdowns, not just here, but across the world, is that they don't seem to have a big impact on suppressing infection. Maybe if you actually board people up in their homes, as they did in Wuhan in February of last year, and have the police deliver food to them, maybe that will suppress the infection. But if you're not going to do that, which I don't think it would be possible to do in our country or in any Western democracy, then inevitably, if you're herding people into supermarkets for 1 hour a week, you're going to say 20% of essential workers just carry on going to work and commuting as normal. Lockdowns don't seem to have any impact at all in suppressing the virus. So I think we've paid an enormous price, not just in terms of sacrificing our liberties, but also the disruption to children's education, the havoc the lockdowns wreak with people's mental health, the enormous waiting list we have now at the NHS because people did stay home to protect the NHS and didn't get vital diseases treated. The cost, it seems to me, in retrospect, is far, far greater than any benefit that the lockdown policies produced.
Now, I share your view on that one. There will be many watching, and I've had many people on my show who take the opposite view and think that we had to lock down to save lives. But I'm certainly with you on that one. Do you think we'll ever get the truth about whether lockdowns were a mistake? Because my concern is that if there are any future public inquiries, there is an entire generation of politicians and sage scientists who will do everything to prove that it was necessary and the right thing to do.
Well, I'm sure, Mark, depressingly, we'll still be arguing about this in probably 50, 100 years' time. I don't suppose there will ever be a definitive consensus about the lockdown policy. I think as time goes on and as the unintended consequences become more and more clear, as we see its impact on the economy, on the closure of small businesses and so forth, I think people will begin to sour on the policy and it'll become a lot more politically difficult to impose lockdowns again. But the reason it's a very difficult argument to win is because the defenders of lockdown can always come back at you when you point out all the collateral damage done by the lockdown policy and the apparent lack of impact on preventing transmission of the virus. They can say, but if we hadn't locked down, look what these models said. They projected that hundreds of thousands of people would die. Only 135,000 people have died. Therefore, the lockdown policy has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Yes, there is this collateral damage, but think how much worse the loss of life would be had we not locked down. And that's a counterfactual. It's quite difficult to prove that the modelers are wrong. We have Sweden as a great kind of control group in which they didn't lock down. They didn't lock down for the whole of 2020. And the number of COVID deaths per million in Sweden is not just below the UK, it's well below the European average. So that suggests that the modelers' dire, gloomy predictions about what would happen if we didn't lock down are probably way off beam. But nonetheless, they're always going to find a way of saying, well, Sweden's different. We're just talking about the UK. Our models are extremely robust and reliable. It would have been far, far worse if we hadn't locked down. And it's quite difficult. You're dealing with people who are very difficult to, it's very difficult to argue with them and get them to change their minds. I've got a debate coming up at the Londoner Hotel on September 27th, in which me and Carl Hennigan and some other people are arguing with some lockdown defenders, but I don't suppose anything will be resolved by that.
Well, I do think that history will judge the lockdown policy very harshly. Time will tell, Toby. So many questions coming in. You are, of course, also, you're the co-founder of so many things, the Free Speech Union. And this is a question from John on GBNews. Toby, what are your views on the restrictions on free speech in New Zealand with the introduction of hate speech rules by Jacinda Ardern? We've also seen, haven't we? I can't remember if it was Australia or New Zealand, but people were told not to talk to their neighbours.
Yeah, it's one of the really sinister things about the last 18 months is the way in which the pandemic has been used by the enemies of free speech to shut down dissent. And we see it on the social media companies all the time. And it's particularly pronounced in Australia and New Zealand, which have the toughest lockdown policies in the world and are still pursuing this kind of crazy pipe dream of zero COVID and discovering that they're never going to achieve that. It's really sinister, really alarming. As you said in your introduction, Mark, I helped set up an organization called the Free Speech Union, which stands up for the speech rights of its members back in February of last year. And there is now a sister organization in New Zealand, which has been very energetically campaigning against the draconian anti-hate speech laws in New Zealand. And it's a real worry. We saw the hate crime bill passed in Scotland earlier this year. Whereby if you say something in the privacy of your own home that is that one of your children, for instance, thinks it constitutes hate speech, they can dob you in to the police, and the police will then feel compelled to investigate you. That's a really sinister development. I think it means that there's now worse protections for free speech in Scotland than anywhere else in Europe, including Hungary. And really alarmingly, there's a very similar proposal currently bubbling away in Northern Ireland the Law Commission of England and Wales have recommended that England and Wales introduce a very similar hate crime bill to the one that passed in Scotland earlier this year. So we need to really stand up and oppose these bills, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves living in a much less free society in very short order.
Toby, the clock is against us. So many more questions. Let's power through a couple. First of all, Robin on Twitter. Toby, why are universities setting out to destroy the history of the country that is their home?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I understand the psychological pathology which leads some of the most brilliant, best educated, most scholarly people in the country to engage in this kind of national self-loathing, in which they think that Britain is one of the worst countries in the world, with nothing in its history to be proud of. It's extraordinary. And one of the things we find ourselves doing all the time at the Free Speech Union is trying to come to the defense of academics and students who've tried to stand up against this kind of new kind of Maoist climate that's sweeping through universities. Anyone now who defends, anyone who has a nice word to say about the British Empire at a university, and the more prestigious the university, the less tolerance for this kind of dissent there is. Anyone who has a good word to say about the British Empire is immediately targeted for cancellation. And if even quite senior academics can face career ruin when they're targeted by a group of outraged wokesters on campus. And it's terrible. And I hope that the government's higher education bill will do something to better protect free speech on England's campuses.
Toby, throughout your life, you have been the reluctant campaigner on education, on free speech, and now on lockdowns. What motivates you? Because your business is journalism, but you don't really profit from so much of what you do. So what motivates you?
I suppose when I see something that I think is wrong, an injustice, and I think it can be fixed, rather than hang around in the hope that someone else is going to fix the problem. I feel like I have to kind of throw myself into the fray and try and fix it myself, which, as you say, is not a great career strategy, because you end up making a lot of enemies and annoying a lot of people. But that was very much the case with the school problem. You know, lots of parents where I live who aren't C of E, who aren't Catholic, who don't live within the catchment area of one of the handful of really good schools in Acton, had the same problem that me and my wife faced. You know, what are we going to do? Are we going to have to move to secure a decent education for our children? And I thought, yeah, this is a fixable problem. If enough parents and teachers come together, given the possibility now of setting up free schools, they could create the kind of school we want in our neighborhood that we could send our children to without having to completely upend our lives and travel halfway across the country. But I realized it was pointless just waiting for someone to do it. No one was going to do it if I didn't do it. And on the other hand, if I did do it, and I did it successfully, and I was lucky to be surrounded by a group of very able, talented people who were helping me, I realized that I could blaze a trail which other parents and teachers could follow. And that's exactly what happened. We were the first free school to sign a funding agreement with Michael Gove, the then Education Secretary. There are now over 600 free schools in England and another 50 or so in the pipeline. So it proved to be a very rewarding experience, though at times it was pretty touch and go.
Toby Young, you are a champion of free speech, and for that I salute you and thank you. And I do hope you'll join us in the studio here at GB News, and perhaps we can debate and disagree and have a proper discourse. Brilliant stuff, Toby. What's the website? Take me to the most important website. I mean, Lockdown Skeptics has now become thedailysceptic.org. Is that right?
That's right. And if anyone is concerned about the erosion of free speech in this country, or concerned that they might be punished for exercising their lawful right to free speech, then you can join the Free Speech Union. It's for students, pensioners, veterans. It's less than 25 quid a year. That's freespeechunion.org, freespeechunion.org.
Worth every penny in my book. Thank you. We'll speak soon, Toby.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.